Northern Minnesota, October 1949. While the farmers of Pine County were stacking firewood and sealing windows in preparation for another brutal winter, 16-year-old Hannah Lindqvist was digging a trench in the frozen ground behind the abandoned homestead where she and her 8-year-old sister Elsa had been living since their parents' deaths 6 months earlier. The neighbors who passed by on the road, the few who still bothered to check on the orphaned sisters, shook their heads at what they saw. The older girl was clearly losing her mind, they whispered to each other. Digging holes in the ground when she should be finding a proper home for herself and her little sister, wasting the last warm days of autumn on some foolish project instead of preparing for the cold that would soon make survival impossible for 2 children alone. "That underground fireplace idea of hers is pure insanity," said old Gustav Eriksson at the general store in town. "You can't put fire underground. The smoke has nowhere to go. She'll suffocate herself and that poor little girl, or burn the whole place down, or both." But Hannah Lindqvist had spent 16 years listening to her grandmother's stories about the old country, about the ways that Swedish and Finnish settlers had survived winters that made Minnesota seem mild, about heating systems that had kept families warm for centuries before coal and oil and modern furnaces made such knowledge seem obsolete. Her grandmother had drawn diagrams, had explained principles, had made Hannah promise to remember, because someday, she said, the old ways might matter again. If you want to find out how 2 orphaned sisters survived a winter that killed livestock in barns and froze pipes in insulated houses, playing barefoot in their cabin while temperatures outside dropped to 40 below zero, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what Hannah Lindqvist built that autumn saved not only her sister's life, but eventually changed how an entire region thought about heating and survival. The Lindqvist family had been fixtures in Pine County for 3 generations, Swedish immigrants who had carved a farm from wilderness and maintained it through decades of hard work and harder winters. Hannah's great-grandparents had arrived in 1882 with nothing but determination and knowledge accumulated over centuries of surviving Scandinavian cold. They had built their homestead using techniques that their neighbors, mostly American-born settlers from milder climates, had considered primitive and unnecessary. Why dig into the ground when you could build on top of it? Why construct complicated heating systems when a simple stove would suffice? The Lindqvist homestead had always been slightly different from its neighbors, slightly strange, slightly old-fashioned in ways that invited gentle mockery from people who considered themselves more modern and progressive. Hannah's parents had continued some of the old traditions while abandoning others, maintaining the underground root cellar that stayed cool in summer and warm in winter, keeping the traditional Swedish stove design that her great-grandfather had built, but switching to a modern furnace when the old heating system had seemed like too much trouble to maintain. They had been good parents, loving and capable, teaching their daughters the skills necessary for farm life, while also ensuring they received proper education in the town school. They had expected to live long lives, to see their daughters grow up and marry and have children of their own. They had not expected to die together in a car accident on an icy road in April, leaving a 16-year-old and an 8-year-old alone in a world that suddenly seemed much colder than any Minnesota winter. The months following their parents' death had been a blur of grief and practical challenges that Hannah had navigated through sheer determination. Relatives had offered to take the girls in, but the offers had come with conditions that Hannah found unacceptable. Her aunt in Minneapolis wanted Elsa, but considered Hannah old enough to find work and support herself. Her uncle in Wisconsin was willing to take both girls, but planned to sell the family farm, erasing the only home Elsa had ever known. Various cousins offered temporary shelter, but made clear that permanent arrangements would need to be found elsewhere. Hannah had rejected all of these options, had insisted that she and Elsa would stay on the family land, would maintain the homestead that 3 generations of Lindqvists had built. The authorities had been skeptical, but ultimately uninvolved. The county too overwhelmed with other problems during the difficult post-war years to spend resources forcing 2 orphans into arrangements they did not want. As long as the girls attended school and showed no signs of obvious neglect, they were left alone to manage as best they could. Summer had been manageable, the farm producing enough vegetables to eat and sell, the weather warm enough that heating was unnecessary, the days long enough to accomplish the work that 2 people had to do alone. But autumn brought shorter days and colder nights, and the growing awareness that winter was coming. And winter in northern Minnesota was not something that children could survive without proper preparation. The problem was heat. The family farmhouse had been heated by an oil furnace that Hannah could not afford to operate, the cost of fuel far exceeding anything she could earn from the small farm's production. The old Swedish stove that her great-grandfather had built was still functional, but required constant feeding, someone awake through the night to add wood every few hours, attention that Hannah could not provide while also caring for Elsa and maintaining the farm. The wood stove in the kitchen helped during the day, but could not keep the house warm overnight, and Hannah had already experienced nights in September when she and Elsa had woken shivering under every blanket they owned, the indoor temperature barely above freezing, despite a fire that had been roaring when they went to bed. At 40 below zero, which happened multiple times each winter in Pine County, the house would become uninhabitable within hours of the fire dying. They would freeze to death in their beds, or they would have to keep someone awake all night, every night, for 5 months, an impossible demand that would destroy their health, even if they managed to maintain it. Hannah had spent weeks considering alternatives, each one proving impractical or impossible for 2 children with no money and no adult help. She could not afford oil. She could not maintain a fire around the clock. She could not insulate the old farmhouse well enough to retain heat through the long winter nights. Every conventional solution required resources she did not have. The answer came from her grandmother's stories, memories that surfaced during sleepless nights when Hannah lay awake worrying about how to keep her sister alive through the coming winter. Her grandmother had spoken of the old ways, the heating systems that Finnish and Swedish settlers had used before modern fuels became available. Systems that had been forgotten because they required more initial labor than simply burning oil or coal, but that operated more efficiently once constructed. The specific technology that grandmother had described was called a kakelugn in Swedish, a masonry heater that stored heat in massive amounts of stone or brick and released it slowly over many hours. But grandmother had also described something older, something that predated even the traditional masonry stoves, underground heating systems, where fire burned in channels beneath the floor, warming the entire structure from below, rather than trying to heat air that constantly escaped through walls and ceilings. The Romans had called such systems hypercausts, and had used them to heat their bathhouses. The Koreans had developed a similar technology called ondol that had kept their homes warm for over 2,000 years. The principle was simple. Hot air and combustion gases from a fire were channeled through passages beneath the floor before exiting through a chimney. The floor itself, made of stone or packed earth, absorbed heat from the passing gases and radiated it upward into the living space. Because the heat was stored in massive amounts of thermal material rather than in air, it persisted for many hours after the fire died, allowing a single firing to provide warmth through an entire night or even longer. Hannah began planning her underground heating system in late September, sketching designs based on her grandmother's descriptions and whatever information she could find in the small-town library. The resources were limited. A few paragraphs about Roman hypocausts in an ancient history book, A brief mention of Korean ondol in a geography text. Nothing that provided the engineering details she would need to construct a functional system. But the basic principle was clear enough. Dig channels beneath the floor, connect them to a firebox at one end and a chimney at the other. Cover them with materials that would absorb and slowly release heat. The specifics she would have to figure out through experimentation, through trial and error, through the same practical problem-solving that her ancestors had used when they built the original homestead without the benefit of modern engineering education. She chose to build her system not in the main farmhouse, which was too large to heat efficiently and too well constructed to excavate beneath, but in a smaller outbuilding that had once served as a summer kitchen and storage shed. The structure was simple, perhaps 20 feet by 15 feet, with a wooden floor that could be removed and the dirt foundation that could be excavated without damaging anything structural. If her system worked, she and Elsa could live in the small building through the winter, heated by the underground fire. If it failed, they would have lost nothing except time and effort, and would have to find some other solution to the heating problem that might not have a solution at all. The digging began in early October, Hannah working every hour she could spare from farm chores and Elsa's care, often continuing by lantern light after darkness fell. She excavated trenches roughly 2 feet deep and 18 inches wide, creating a serpentine pattern that would carry hot gases across the entire floor area before reaching the chimney on the opposite side of the building. The work was backbreaking, the ground already hardening with the approaching cold, her muscles screaming protest after hours of shoveling soil that seemed determined to resist her efforts. Elsa helped where she could, carrying smaller loads of dirt to the pile outside, bringing water and food to her sister, providing company and encouragement during the long hours of labor. The townspeople who saw Hannah digging continued to express their opinions, their skepticism growing as the project's scale became apparent. "She's building herself a grave," one neighbor remarked to another. "That whole thing will collapse the first time she lights a fire in it, or the smoke will back up and poison them both. There's a reason people don't heat buildings from underground anymore." But Hannah ignored the criticism, trusting her grandmother's knowledge over the opinions of people who had never heard of hypocausts or ondol, who assumed that modern methods were superior simply because they were modern. The construction required materials that Hannah could not buy, so she scavenged and improvised. Flat stones from the creek bed formed the floor of the channels, laid carefully to create a smooth surface that would not obstruct airflow. Clay, dug from a deposit near the pond, served as mortar and sealant, filling gaps between stones and coating surfaces to prevent smoke from escaping into the living space. The firebox was built from bricks salvaged from a collapsed chimney on the neighboring property, arranged to create a combustion chamber that would burn wood efficiently and direct hot gases into the underground channels. The chimney on the opposite end used the same salvaged bricks, rising high enough above the roofline to create proper draft. The floor that covered the channels was the most critical element, needing to be sturdy enough to walk on while thin enough to conduct heat efficiently into the room above. Hannah used flat stones for this purpose as well, larger pieces laid across the channels and sealed with clay, creating a continuous stone surface that would absorb heat from the gases passing beneath and radiate it upward into the living space. Above the stone, she added a layer of packed earth and clay that would provide additional thermal mass while creating a surface smooth enough for comfortable living. The total thickness of the floor was perhaps 8 inches. 8 inches of material that would absorb heat all day from a morning fire and release it slowly through the night, keeping the small building warm without any additional fuel. November arrived before the system was complete, bringing cold that tested Hannah's determination and Elsa's faith in her older sister's project. They slept in the main farmhouse during those final weeks of construction, huddled together under every blanket they owned, the wood stove in the kitchen providing barely enough heat to keep them from freezing when temperatures dropped into the single digits overnight. Hannah worked through the cold, her hands cracking and bleeding, her body exhausted from labor and inadequate nutrition. Her mind focused entirely on finishing before real winter arrived and made completion impossible. The first test firing happened on November 15th, a clear, cold day when the temperature hovered near zero, and the skeptical neighbors found excuses to pass by on the road and watch for the disaster they expected. Hannah built a small fire in the firebox, carefully monitoring the smoke to ensure it was drawing through the channels rather than backing up into the living space. The system worked. Smoke rose from the chimney on the far end of the building, white against the gray sky, proof that gases were flowing through the underground passages as designed. Over the following hours, the stone floor gradually warmed, absorbing heat from the combustion gases passing beneath. By evening, the surface was warm to the touch, radiating gentle heat upward into the space above. The temperature inside the small building rose to 60 degrees and held there, maintained not by a continuously burning fire, but by heat stored in hundreds of pounds of stone that would continue radiating warmth for hours after the fire had gone out. The first real test came in early December, when a cold front dropped temperatures to 25 below zero and kept them there for 3 consecutive days. Hannah fired the underground system twice daily, morning and evening, burning perhaps 30 pounds of wood total compared to the 100 pounds or more that would have been required to maintain a conventional stove through such extreme cold. The stone floor stayed warm enough to walk on barefoot, a sensation so strange and wonderful that Elsa spent hours playing on the heated surface, building block towers and arranging her dolls on a floor that radiated comfort rather than stealing warmth from bare feet. The air temperature inside the small building stayed above 55 degrees even during the coldest nights, warm enough for comfort under a single blanket, warm enough to sleep soundly without waking shivering at 3 in the morning. Gustav Eriksson, who had predicted disaster, made the walk out to the Lindqvist homestead on the 3rd day of the cold snap, his curiosity finally overcoming his skepticism. He found Hannah and Elsa comfortable in their small building, the older girl reading, while the younger played on a floor that should have been frozen solid, according to everything Gustav thought he understood about heating and physics. "Feel the floor," Hannah said, and Gustav knelt to place his palm on the packed earth surface, feeling warmth that seemed impossible given the conditions outside. "I don't understand," he admitted. "There's no fire burning. Where's the heat coming from?" Hannah explained the principle: the channels beneath the floor, the thermal mass that stored heat and released it slowly, the technology that her grandmother had described and that people had used for thousands of years before modern heating had made such knowledge seem unnecessary. Gustav listened with growing amazement, recognizing that this 16-year-old girl had solved a problem that many adults in the community faced every winter: the challenge of staying warm without spending money that struggling farms could not afford. Word spread through Pine County with the speed that only remarkable stories achieve in small communities. The orphan Lindqvist girl had built something in that old shed, something that kept her and her sister warm without burning through cords of wood or gallons of expensive oil. People who had predicted disaster now made pilgrimages to see the system for themselves, touching the warm floor with wondering hands, asking questions that Hannah answered with the patient confidence of someone who had figured out the answers through desperate necessity. Some visitors were merely curious, satisfying their interest and returning home to their conventional heating systems without plans to change anything about how they heated their own homes. Others saw potential, recognizing that the technology Hannah had revived could reduce their own fuel costs dramatically, could provide backup heating if their primary furnaces failed, could keep their livestock barns warm enough to prevent the frozen water pipes and hypothermic animals that plagued every winter throughout the region. Farmers who had lost cattle to cold-related complications saw in Hannah's system a way to protect their investments without the crippling expense of heating large barn structures with conventional methods. The technical details fascinated those with engineering backgrounds who came to examine Hannah's work. The key insight was thermal mass, the principle that dense materials like stone and earth could absorb enormous amounts of heat and release it slowly over extended periods. A conventional wood stove heated air, which escaped through every crack and gap in a building's envelope, requiring continuous fuel to maintain temperature. Hannah's system heated stone, which retained that heat for 12 to 18 hours after the fire went out, radiating warmth into the living space without any additional fuel consumption. The efficiency improvement was dramatic. The same amount of wood that would heat a conventional room for 4 hours could heat Hannah's floor-based system for an entire day, because the heat was stored rather than immediately lost to the outside environment. The serpentine pattern of the channels maximized the contact between hot gases and thermal mass, extracting nearly all the available heat before the exhaust reached the chimney. By the time gases exited the system, they were barely warm to the touch. Almost all their energy transferred to the stone floor that would keep the building warm through the coldest nights. By January, Hannah had helped 3 neighboring families begin construction of their own underground heating systems, adapting the basic principle to different building sizes and configurations, learning from each project what worked best and what required modification. She charged nothing for her expertise, asking only that families share their experiences so she could continue improving the designs. The community that had dismissed her as insane in October was treating her as an authority by February, her success transforming perception in ways that mere argument could never have accomplished. The winter of 1949 to 50 was one of the coldest on record in northern Minnesota, with temperatures dropping below -40 on multiple occasions and staying below zero for weeks at a stretch. Livestock died in barns throughout the region. Water pipes froze in houses that should have been adequately heated. Elderly residents suffered frostbite and hypothermia in homes where heating systems could not keep pace with the brutal cold. Hannah and Elsa, in their small building with its underground heating system, remained comfortable throughout. They burned less wood than any other household in the county, while maintaining higher indoor temperatures than most. They played games and read books and did schoolwork on a floor that stayed warm enough for bare feet, even when the world outside was frozen solid. The contrast between their cozy interior and the deadly cold outside became a source of wonder for visitors who stopped by during that brutal winter. Some came out of concern, checking on the orphaned sisters to make sure they had survived the latest cold snap. They found Hannah calmly mending clothes, while Elsa practiced her letters at a small table. The room comfortable enough that neither wore more than a sweater, despite temperatures that would have required heavy coats in any conventionally heated building. Others came out of curiosity, wanting to see for themselves whether the stories about the warm floor were really true. They left convinced, and many of them began planning their own installations for the following autumn. The relationship between the sisters deepened through that winter in ways that only shared survival could create. Hannah had taken on the role of parent as well as sister, making decisions that would affect both their futures, carrying responsibilities that no 16-year-old should have had to bear. Elsa, who had been terrified after their parents' death, who had cried herself to sleep for months wondering what would happen to her, began to believe that her sister could handle anything, that they would be okay despite losing the people who should have protected them. She watched Hannah solve problems that seemed impossible, witnessed her sister's refusal to accept limitations that everyone else considered final, learned that determination and knowledge could overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable. These lessons shaped Elsa's character in ways that would influence her entire life, giving her a confidence in the face of difficulty that would carry her through challenges far beyond that first winter alone. The trust that Hannah earned that winter through keeping her sister warm became the foundation of a relationship that would sustain both of them through the years ahead. They were not just sisters surviving together. They were partners who had faced the worst that nature could deliver and had prevailed through knowledge and determination that most people had forgotten existed. Spring brought warmth that made heating unnecessary, but it also brought recognition that extended far beyond Pine County. A professor of engineering from the state university had heard about Hannah's system and made the trip to see it for himself, arriving with the skepticism of an educated man confronting claims that seemed to contradict basic principles. He left as an enthusiast, recognizing that Hannah had not invented anything new, but had successfully revived technology that modern engineering had largely forgotten. He invited her to present her work at the university, an invitation that would have seemed absurd 6 months earlier, but that Hannah accepted with the quiet confidence of someone who knew her system worked because she had staked her sister's life on it. The presentation attracted attention from agricultural extension agents, from rural development organizations, from anyone concerned with the challenge of keeping people warm in cold climates without expensive fuel. Hannah's underground heating system was not a solution for everyone, required too much initial labor for families unwilling to dig trenches and lay stone floors. But for those who could invest the effort, it offered fuel savings of 50% or more, reliability that did not depend on supply chains or utility companies, warmth that persisted through the night without anyone waking to tend a fire. Hannah graduated from high school in 1951, having maintained her grades despite the demands of caring for Elsa and managing the farm, and becoming an unexpected expert on heating technology. She received scholarship offers from several universities, but declined them all, unwilling to leave Elsa alone, and unconvinced that formal education would teach her anything more useful than what she had already learned through necessity. Instead, she continued developing and teaching her heating methods, traveling throughout the region to help families construct systems adapted to their specific situations. She wrote and illustrated a manual that explained the principles clearly enough for anyone to understand, distributing copies for free to whoever wanted them. She experimented with variations, combining underground heating with masonry stoves, integrating greenhouse spaces that captured solar heat to supplement the thermal mass systems, developing designs suitable for different climates and construction methods. By the time Elsa graduated from high school in 1959, Hannah had helped construct over 200 underground heating systems throughout Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Dakotas, each one representing a family that would stay warm through winter without depending entirely on purchased fuel. Elsa went to college, the first Lindqvist in 4 generations to receive higher education. Her tuition paid partly by money Hannah had saved, and partly by scholarships that recognized her academic excellence. She studied agricultural engineering, bringing formal training to the practical knowledge she had absorbed from her sister over a decade of working together. After graduation, she returned to Pine County and joined Hannah in what had become a small but thriving business, designing and consulting on heating systems that combined traditional principles with modern materials and construction techniques. Together, the sisters developed innovations that their grandmother could never have imagined, integrating underground heating with solar thermal collection, with geothermal heat pumps, with insulation strategies that reduced heat loss to near zero. Their systems were installed in schools and community centers and commercial buildings throughout the upper Midwest, proving that the technology which had kept 2 orphaned girls alive through a brutal winter could scale to meet needs far beyond a single small building. The Lindqvist sisters became recognized authorities on sustainable heating, invited to speak at conferences and consult on projects around the world, their expertise rooted not in academic theory, but in the desperate necessity of a 16-year-old girl who had refused to let her little sister freeze. Hannah Lindqvist died in 2018 at the age of 85, having spent nearly 70 years teaching and improving the heating technology that had saved her and Elsa during that first terrible winter alone. Elsa, now 77, continues the work they began together, operating a consulting firm that specializes in low-energy heating solutions for cold climates. The original building where Hannah constructed her first underground heating system still stands on the Lindquist property, maintained as a demonstration site where visitors can experience the technology that skeptical neighbors once called insane. The floor still warms when fire burns in the channels beneath it, still radiates heat through long winter nights, still allows visitors to walk barefoot on a surface that should be frozen, according to everything they thought they knew about heating buildings in Minnesota. The technology has spread far beyond anything Hannah imagined during those desperate weeks of digging trenches and laying stones. Incorporated into thousands of buildings worldwide, taught in engineering schools that once dismissed such methods as primitive and obsolete. The grandmother whose stories provided the knowledge that saved 2 orphaned girls would be proud to see how far that knowledge has traveled. The lesson of Hannah and Elsa Lindquist's story extends beyond heating technology or survival skills or any specific technique that might be replicated elsewhere. It speaks to the power of inherited knowledge, wisdom passed down through generations that modern people often dismiss as outdated, but that contains solutions to problems we thought required modern solutions. Hannah's grandmother had shared stories that seemed like folklore, descriptions of technology that seemed like history rather than practical information. But when Hannah needed that knowledge, when her sister's life depended on finding a way to stay warm without resources she did not have, the old stories proved more valuable than anything modern expertise could offer. The underground fireplace that everyone called insane was actually ancient wisdom, proven over centuries, forgotten only because easier alternatives had made it seem unnecessary. When those easier alternatives were unavailable, the old ways still worked, still kept people warm, still turned impossible situations into survivable ones. So here is the question for you. What knowledge have you inherited from grandparents or older relatives that you dismissed as outdated or irrelevant? What stories have you heard about how things were done before modern conveniences made such methods seem unnecessary? And what might that knowledge be worth if the modern conveniences became unavailable? If you found yourself facing challenges that required solutions beyond what contemporary approaches could provide? Hannah Lindquist was 16 years old, orphaned, responsible for a little sister who trusted her completely, facing a winter that everyone said would kill them both. She remembered her grandmother's stories and built something that everyone called insane until it worked, until she and Elsa played barefoot on a warm floor while 40 below temperatures froze the world outside. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think differently about old knowledge and new challenges, and the solutions that might be hiding in stories you have not taken seriously enough, hit subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things by remembering what others had forgotten. Because sometimes the most advanced technology is the technology that has worked for thousands of years, waiting to be rediscovered by someone desperate enough to try it.